Ever wondered what lurks in the shadows of a dense, dark forest? Something that is not seen in the light of day, but which, at night, seems to move, gliding between the trees with an agility that defies logic. Something that can make you feel watched, even when you know there's no one there. What if I told you that somewhere, someone has had the experience of confronting this thing and surviving to tell the tale? What if the question was, what would happen if you were that person? My name is Ethan, and in 2021, at the age of 25, I took a job that would take me directly to the heart of one of the most remote and silent forests in the country. It was a simple job, or at least it seemed to be. I would be a park ranger in Silver Pines National Park in Washington, a place far from everything and everyone, where nature reigns absolute and people finally seem to disappear into the immensity of the trees. At that moment, he was not looking for mysteries. I just wanted to escape the pressure of urban life and the expectations attached to my degree in biology. The idea of living in a secluded cabin, in the middle of centuries-old trees, away from the noise of cities and cars, seemed to be the peace I was looking for. The job didn't seem difficult. Basically, monitoring security cameras, making sure poachers didn't enter protected areas, and, if necessary, reporting any anomalies. Nothing I hadn't seen in other temporary jobs before. But Silver Pines had a story that I wasn't fully prepared to uncover. At first, no one talked much about it. Of course, there were some conversations between the older guards, quick mentions about things that don't make sense. When I asked more, it was always something vague, like let it go or it's not worth knowing. But even with the words unspoken, their eyes said it all. Something was wrong, but no one wanted to be responsible for talking about it. The reports I heard were the most varied: trees that moved by themselves, sounds of footsteps that appeared for no reason, screams in the distance in the middle of the night, and most disturbing of all, disappearances. People who ventured on the trails and were never seen again, without explanation. No body, no trace. Just the certainty that somehow the forest took what it wanted, and like any good skeptic, I ignored these stories. I couldn't believe myths, legends or rumors, especially in the modern world, where science explains everything. But I was about to learn that sometimes the inexplicable can't be solved with logic or reason. On the first night at Silver Pines, the sky was clear, the air was cold, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as I monitored the cameras, a strange sensation began to envelop me, as if something was watching me. That night, I was alone in the cabin, comfortable and safe, unaware that the silence of the forest was about to be broken by something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. I just didn't know it yet. But that night, my life would change forever. In my first week at Silver Pines, I barely had time to think about the stories I heard. The work was simple, and the nights were apparently calm. The cabin where I stayed was small but comfortable. There was a table with the security monitors, some chairs, and a closet with basic groceries. The routine was limited to monitoring the park's enclosures and making sure nothing strange happened. Most evenings were spent in the company of my own mind, with few interactions other than radio messages with the other guards during shifts. On one of those nights around 11 p.m., I received the first call from Andrew, one of the other rangers who worked at the park. He had a calm voice, always seemed calm, and this time he asked me if everything was okay with the monitors. The work was quite routine, so we always ended up checking in on each other just in case. I said that everything was in order, that the system was stable, and there was no movement other than the wild animals that crossed the boundaries of the park. Sometimes a deer, sometimes a fox or a squirrel approaching the fence. Andrew was right to keep his watch. In 2018, a group of researchers was attacked by an unknown predator while conducting a study in the most isolated part of the park. Although the details of the attack were never officially revealed, Some anonymous sources mentioned that the researchers had seen something large and fast moving between the trees. Nothing was found after the search. The incidents continued, though discreetly, and the sense of inexplicable danger slowly increased. At first, I was reluctant to believe the stories, but when I started doing my own work, the little things started to worry me. That night, around 0:45 a.m., an incident made me question what was really going on at Silver Pines. One of the cameras in the northern sector of the park, which covered one of the densest areas of the forest, detected movement. Usually this meant an animal or some hunter trying to break in. When I accessed the screen, I saw something that made me hesitate. It was a deer, but it was no ordinary deer. Your eyes were different. They shone with a golden hue, in a strange way, as if reflecting a light that was not there. I tried to trigger the buzzer to scare the animal away, but it didn't move. The deer remained motionless, its eyes fixed on the camera before disappearing into the darkness. I watched for a few more minutes, trying to understand what I had seen. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just a strange reflection of the lights from the cameras or some glitch in the monitors. However, what bothered me was the feeling I had soon after. A feeling that something was closer than I imagined. Something wrong. I decided not to mention the incident to others yet. After all, the most logical explanation would be that it was some technical error. I knew that anything that was considered out of the ordinary could generate panic, especially among the other guards, who, until then, had been more focused on daily tasks than on the mysteries of the forest. But as the night wore on, a growing sense told me that this technical error wasn't just a coincidence. As it got close to 3 a.m., the radio rang again. It was Harley, one of the guards who worked with me, and her voice sounded full of tension. "Alex, I'm seeing something. Can you take a look at the East Sector cam? Something strange is happening here." The restlessness in her voice made me think two things. Either Harley was starting to get paranoid, or whatever was happening at Silver Pines wasn't just a series of coincidences. I accessed the monitor of the Eastern Sector, and for the first time I saw something even more disturbing. What appeared to be a human figure, pale, with uncoordinated movements, was moving among the trees, but not like a normal person. It was as if she was trying to hide, but she was also being attracted to the light of the camera, like a shadow that formed with each step. The strangest thing was the golden glow that reflected from his eyes, just like the deer. "Harley, are you sure about that? What's going on?" I asked, my voice more tense than I wanted. I didn't know what else to ask. But before she could answer, the radio abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was palpable. It was not the ordinary silence of the forest, but rather that kind of charged silence which presaged something much greater. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to process what I had seen and heard. Something was definitely wrong at Silver Pines, and for the first time, I didn't know what else to expect when the sun went down. What I didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. What follows in the hours after that night, with the images of golden eyes and strange figures in the woods, is a whirlwind of thoughts and feelings. Fear is a silent force, often invisible, but with the power to consume any logical reasoning. It infiltrates your decisions, your perceptions, and even your body. And as the hours passed, I realized that I was starting to lose control over him. Anxiety is an immediate reflection of fear. When fear sets in, our mind begins to question reality. Did I really see that? Am I imagining things? But more importantly, it begins to destabilize our understanding of the surrounding environment. Everything starts to look like a potential threat. The sound of a branch breaking in the distance, the rustling of leaves, or the simple movement in the shadows. It all begins to seem like something that is waiting to attack us. For some time, After the incident with Harley and the images on the monitor, fear was a constant presence. I knew something was wrong, but my mind refused to accept it. The feeling of being watched kept growing. Maybe it was just a wild animal, something out of the ordinary but still explainable. However, a part of me knew that there was no explanation. It was the kind of fear that can't be rationalized. I didn't know what was real anymore and what was just my mind trying to keep me sane. During the following days, the fear manifested itself in subtle ways. When I went out to make the rounds, I felt as if I was being watched, as if the eyes of the trees were on me. Every step I took seemed to echo stronger than usual, as if I was being followed. And at night, when reviewing the security monitors, the feeling of being watched increased even more, as if somehow I was in a game where the only rule was to wait for the moment when I would be captured. I knew I had to stay calm. The protocol was simple: monitor the perimeters, check security, and report any incident. But when something so inexplicable begins to invade your reality, logic begins to fail. Anxiety washed over me as the nights passed. Every sound, every faint vibration made me question if it was just a coincidence or if something was finally happening that I couldn't avoid. It was on one of these nights, close to midnight, that something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was sitting in front of the monitors, my gaze fixed on the cameras, trying to stay focused, when I saw something that made me freeze. In the upper corner of the screen, the movement of a pale figure appeared. He was not an animal. He was not a hunter. He was a human figure, but he didn't look human. His skin was pale, almost grey, and his movements were so disconnected that he looked more like a puppet being controlled by invisible wires. His eyes, once again, shone with an intense golden hue. They stared at me, fixed, as if they knew exactly where I was. What was that? An illusion? A flaw in the system? Or was it real? My heart raced. I knew that, as a park ranger, my first reaction should be to report the incident, but a part of me didn't want to share it with others. The fear of being ridiculed, of being treated as someone who didn't know how to distinguish reality from paranoia, paralyzed me. So I just stood there, watching, until the figure disappeared into the shadows of the forest, as if it had never existed. I took a deep breath, trying to regain control, but the anxiety was about to consume me. What did that mean? I knew that this was not something normal. No matter how much he tried to rationalize, he could no longer disregard what he saw. When the radio finally crackled, it was Andrew. His voice was strained, and he said only one sentence: "Did you see what I saw?" His words cut through the silence, and a chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what he had seen, but the mere fact that he asked confirmed that I was not alone in that nightmare. I shared what I had seen, and to my surprise, he didn't hesitate. "I saw the same thing," he replied, "but it wasn't on the monitor. I was on the patrol and saw a figure in the forest. It wasn't human, Alex. I don't know what it is, but we're not alone here." I heard the sounds of the radio, the sound of footsteps, and the silence, as if he was also trying to process what was happening. The feeling that, at that moment, we were both trapped in something much bigger than a simple scientific explanation was clear to me. Fear had already dominated the words and thoughts. There was no longer any doubt. Something was happening at Silver Pines, and it was happening now. As we were talking, an idea popped into my mind. Something inside me knew that the next step was to get out of where we were, to get out of this booth. But at the same time, the fear was so great that my hand trembled at the thought of it. We were both starting to realize that there was no more security on the cameras or on the fences in the park. The only thing left was to face what was watching us. I looked at the monitor again, trying to see something else. And that's when I saw it. On the screen, a shadow moved slowly towards our security station. That night was the turning point. Something inside me had known that things would not return to normal. Fear, once controlled, now took deep root, turning every second into a mental endurance test. When the mysterious figure appeared on the screen for the last time, and I saw the shadowy movement approaching the station, something inside me broke. We were dealing with something that wasn't just weird, it was predatory. I tried to ward off the panic, but I knew that the anxiety that dominated my body was just the tip of the iceberg. The idea that this creature, or whatever it was, adapted to our environment, watching us and learning with every move, was terrifying. I didn't know if it was some kind of intelligence or if it was a primitive and merciless force adapting itself to our weaknesses. But one thing was clear. What was happening there was not a coincidence. It was not something fleeting. The evolution of the creatures that inhabited Silver Pines seemed to be happening right before my eyes, and I was beginning to understand the pattern. Andrew and Harley were not long in arriving at the cabin. Their expression was somber, with nervous and uncomfortable looks. Andrew entered first, breathing heavily, as if trying to calm his own thoughts. "Ethan, did you see what I saw? The creature that appeared on my round?" he asked, almost breathless. The mere fact that he did not dispute my version of the facts made me realize that we were all trapped in the same nightmare. As Harley checked the safety monitors, we tried to get our observations in order. The first thing we all noticed was that the creature, if we can call it that, seemed to have an unsettling ability to adapt to any situation. One night, she looked like a human being, moving slowly and uncoordinated. In another, his movements became agile, like a fleeting shadow. The next morning, as we discussed what had occurred, it became clear that whatever it was, this entity was not confined to a single behavior or form. "They're changing," Harley said, her voice strained. "Every night they seem to adapt, as if they were studying us. They are no longer just monsters. Now they are something more, something conscious." I knew she was right, but there was something more, a sense that this wasn't just about a creature. Something darker, deeper seemed to be behind this process of adaptation. That night, when the sun went down and darkness took over Silver Pines, the tension was at its peak. I was alone in the cabin, watching the cameras and trying to understand what was happening, when suddenly something unusual appeared. The figure approaching the station looked different, more solid, more real. I watched as she approached the security fences, moving with an impossible precision of an animal, as if she already knew where each camera was, where each movement would be captured. It was clear to me, the creature was learning. It was adapting to our technology, observing our behavior patterns and learning from them. Each night, the figure that appeared in the images was stronger, more agile. On one of those nights, she came so close to the station that I could almost hear her heavy footsteps through the wall. It wasn't just a physical threat, it was a being that evolved, adapting to its predator. The strangest thing about it all was the way she seemed to study us, as if he were creating a strategy, as if he were analyzing us, looking for weaknesses. It made me think of something I didn't want to accept. We weren't dealing with an isolated creature. We were dealing with a force that had a purpose, a goal. And as much as we tried to escape, she was always one step ahead, learning, changing. Called Andrew and Harley, trying to articulate what I was seeing, but anxiety choked my voice. I could no longer differentiate between what was real and what was the effect of fear on my mind. "We need to get out of here," Andrew said firmly. But I knew the situation had already become irreversible. The creature wasn't just adapting to us. It was evolving in ways we couldn't even imagine. And if she already knew everything we needed to do, what was left for us? As the nights passed and the creature's presence grew stronger, the feeling of helplessness grew. Everything we had tried so far to protect ourselves seemed to be useless. The worst thing was the feeling of being manipulated, of playing a game of cat and mouse without knowing the rules. As we prepared for the next shift, a sense of absolute terror washed over me. We were about to find out how far this creature would be able to go, but what happened that night, this was beyond what any of us could have imagined. As the nights passed, an unsettling feeling came over me. I knew that the creatures were approaching a level of evolution that was impossible to control or even understand. Every step we took towards safety seemed to be an illusion, as if we were trapped in an endless cycle of fear and attempted escape. But what really disturbed me, more than anything else, was the growing doubt about what was real and what was just my mind beginning to deteriorate under the pressure. I began to question every shadow I saw, every movement I detected on the security cameras. The sound of trees swaying in the wind at night, something that had once seemed comforting to me, now put me on alert. I found myself looking at each tree, expecting to see something move, something that shouldn't be there. Every time a shadow moved on the screen, my heart raced. But the most disconcerting thing was when I found myself fixated on something in the images, but I couldn't distinguish what was real and what was just being projected by my tired mind. Fear was transformed into a parallel reality where nothing else seemed to make sense. Every time I looked at the cameras, it seemed that something had changed. What was once a creature in an irregular shape now looked more solid, more human, as if he were learning not only to move, but to disguise himself as us. Somewhere, at some point, this creature had begun to mimic our own behaviors, and that made me even more uncomfortable. It was as if there was a fine line between what was reality and what my mind was beginning to create. I could have sworn that on some occasions I saw the golden eyes in the shadows of the trees, but when I looked at the screen again, the image was empty. My head was starting to get confused. I didn't know if I was imagining it or if it was really happening. But one thing I knew for sure, the perception of reality was changing. I talked to Andrew about what was going on. He was tensing up, and his words seemed hollow, as if he no longer had control over the situation. Alex, I don't know what's real anymore. Sometimes I feel like I'm seeing things that aren't there. I saw something tonight, something that moved but was nowhere on the screen, as if he were watching me from outside the image. I don't know if it's fear or if it's something else. I knew what he meant. The lines between perception and reality were blurring. The night became thicker and thicker, and the tension between us, which was supposed to keep us on our toes, began to create an even more suffocating atmosphere. We felt like rats in a trap that never closed completely, but whose presence caused us incessant fear. As the hours passed, I noticed something even more disturbing. I was no longer alone in the cabin. Not physically, but the feeling that something was moving behind me, always present, never moving away. With each glance at the monitors, the creature seemed to be closer, more defined. His movements, although still erratic, were now more coordinated, almost as if he were training. It felt like I was studying myself, observing not only my reactions, but also how I used the monitors, as if he knew he was being watched and therefore adjusted his strategy. I knew the cameras weren't failing. What I saw on the screens was not a reflection of failures in the system. It was real, and when I turned quickly toward the cabin window, I could almost feel a presence there, out of my sight, something sneaking through the trees. A shiver ran down my spine. Reality was distorting in such a way that I no longer knew if I was observing something physical or if my mind was starting to play tricks on me. That sense of being watched, The constant fear that the next shadow might be the last began to stir my judgment. It was as if the park itself was alive, as if the environment had absorbed something of all the things that went on there, and now it was turning into a hunting ground. I tried to record the information calmly, but my body was panicking. Each sound of a branch breaking in the distance made me jump in my chair, my breath panting, my heart beating faster. There was no more rest. The darkness surrounding the park seemed to swallow it all, and I found myself asking, is the creature becoming part of the environment, or am I the one starting to disappear into what scares me? I had no answer, and what scared me the most was knowing that once again we were being watched. I knew we couldn't wait any longer. We needed to act. But when I got up to check the cameras again, something on the screen made me stop. Something. I didn't want to believe I was seeing. I was beginning to understand what was happening, but at the same time it didn't make any sense. The creature, or whatever it was approaching something even more threatening. It was no longer a matter of running away or being taken by surprise. The rules had changed. I felt that somehow she already knew what we were going to do, as if she had predicted our movements before she even took them. That night, the radio crackled with Harley's voice, more tense than I had ever heard it before. Alex, we're starting to lose control here. I saw something in the forest. It was large, almost the size of a man, but with an impossible agility. And his eyes, they were golden, just like you said. My mind was working a mile a minute. Harley was just a few feet away from me, so the idea that she would have seen the same thing made me more alert than ever. She wasn't the only one. Andrew had also realized what was happening. Whatever was hiding in the shadows, observing and learning our patterns, was evolving in a way we never imagined. We were dealing with an enemy that not only adapted to its surroundings, but also became smarter as time went on. Reality was in a downward spiral, and nothing else seemed reliable. Everything that once seemed normal, the routine, the protocols, even the way we work, now seemed like a trap, an unconscious preparation for the impending conflict. We felt the presence of the enemy, but we could not see him completely. With every movement on the screen, with every sound on the radio, everything seemed to involve the unknown. I was beginning to understand that it was no longer a matter of surviving, but of confronting something that was manipulating us like puppets, knowing exactly what it was going to do next. That's when the situation escalated unexpectedly. I was on one of the loneliest shifts when I started hearing the sound I feared. It was a low, barely perceptible sound, like a murmur coming from deep in the forest. I looked at the monitors, but there was nothing. Nothing but shadows and trees, still and silent. But the sound continued, a growing presence that seemed to get closer and closer. It wasn't natural, and it made me gulp. Something was coming. The tension increased when, suddenly, the camera in the north zone captured something. It was a silhouette, moving irregularly, with its arms stretched out in front, as if it were feeling its way. The creature seemed to be more confused, more erratic, as if it was learning how to move in a more human way. But as he got closer, his form became even more defined. It was not a shadow. It was a being, something with deformed proportions, but with an intelligence behind its movements. His eyes shone a golden hue, brighter than ever, lighting the way as if they were watching intently everything we did, waiting for a wrong move. Suddenly, the cabin lights flashed, and before I could process it, a heavy bang sounded near the door. The impact made the ground shake, and my heart stopped. I knew it was happening. It was no longer just a presence on camera. Whatever it was right here. Outside the cabin. I couldn't move. The adrenaline froze me and my mind started racing in circles. I looked at the cameras again, but the figure was gone. Nothing, only silence. But the sound of heavy breathing, which I only noticed when I looked towards the door, continued. It was then that the radio crackled again. It was Andrew, with an urgency in his voice that I never imagined hearing from him. "Alex, it's time to act. We can't wait any longer. They know where we are and they're getting closer." The tension was at breaking point. The fact that Andrew had felt the same way, knew the same thing as me, made me realize that attempts to ignore what was happening were no longer possible. The creature was now aware of our presence, and we were the targets. But the biggest dilemma was how to fight against something that seemed to anticipate our every move. How to face something that adapted, that knew our weaknesses, our fears. We were just pieces in a bigger game, and that being seemed to control all the moves. I didn't know what to do. The only thing left was to risk facing what was watching us, or surrender completely. And as the clock ticked down the final hours of our endurance, one thing became clear. We were no longer in control. The struggle for survival was no longer a choice. It was an imposition, a need that became more urgent by the second. I clasped my hand on the gun at my side, feeling the sweat run down my forehead as the sound of shadows at my door grew. We needed to act, now. And reality, once again, twisted around us until we no longer knew what was left of the truth. The next few minutes were like an eternity. We were all in the cabin, waiting, listening to every sound, trying to notice any movement in the shadows of the forest. Fear, which had once seemed controllable, was now an overwhelming presence. I knew we could no longer rely on our senses, nor the cameras, nor the sounds. Whatever it was manipulating us, and with each passing second, it became more skilled at deceiving us. Mimicry, I now realized, was an essential part of the threat. At first, I thought the creature was just a strange beast, something out of the ordinary, but it soon became clear that what we faced had an ability to imitate, to distort, to deceive in a way that went beyond mere physicality. Each time we looked at the forest, the shape of the shadows seemed to change. When the figures appeared on the cameras, they were no longer the same. The creature was not limited to a single appearance or behavior. She adapted, camouflaged herself, and most insidiously impersonated us. That night, the evidence of this appeared in a brutal way. I was monitoring the cameras when suddenly a movement in one of them made me stop breathing. I stared at the monitor, trying to identify what was happening. The figure on the screen was almost identical to Andrew, the same kind of posture, the same shape, right down to the jacket he wore. But when I looked closer, something wasn't right. The movements were erratic, disjointed, and the eyes, those golden eyes, shone in the darkness, reflecting a light that shouldn't have been there. Andrew would never look like that. That wasn't him. I pressed the radio button, feeling my heart race. "Andrew, is that you? Where are you?" My voice came out shaky, and I felt helpless. On the other side, the radio was silent for a moment until Andrew's voice finally appeared, but there was something strange about it. "Yes, Alex. I'm on my way. Don't worry, I'm in the western sector, right now." But the voice was more muffled, distant, and for a moment it seemed phony, as if it wasn't Andrew talking. I looked at the monitor again, and the figure approaching the booth still moved with the same familiar gestures, but it was impossible to ignore that something was wrong. I knew it wasn't Andrew, but it felt like a reflection of him, a distorted reflection. I quickly turned to the cabin window and looked out to the west sector. Nothing, no movement, no presence. The sound of the radio cut off again, and the voice returned, now more urgent. "Alex, something's not right here. I'm seeing him. Or rather, I'm seeing something moving as if it were... It's close to the fence, and he's watching me." I knew it. It was no longer a matter of doubt. Whatever was approaching us had now become something capable of deceiving our senses, of using our own memories and expectations against us. He knew what we feared. He knew how to disguise himself. The creature was imitating Andrew, trying to create an illusion that would confuse our perception of reality. I felt a growing agony. We were at the mercy of something that could not be confronted in a logical way. It was a struggle against our own sanity, against our ability to discern what was real and what was being manipulated. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Harley seemed to understand what was happening because, with a tense look, she approached. "Alex, if he's trying to imitate us, then what we need to do is not react. Don't trust anything that looks familiar. We need to trust our instincts." It was a desperate strategy, but fear had already taken hold of all of us. We tried to rationalize what was happening, but with each second, the rules of the game became more confusing. We could no longer trust our own eyes. All we had were our sensations and our reactions. And, more importantly, we had to find a way to identify what was real and what was being manufactured by this unseen, manipulative force. It was then that I heard something outside. It was a distant but clear sound coming from the darkness of the forest. It was the sound of footsteps, but not human footsteps. They were heavy, distorted, as if something was trying to walk in a human way, but couldn't. I took a deep breath and looked at the monitor again, but this time there was no figure there. All was silent. But for a brief moment, I felt something watching. And the fear that followed was like overwhelming pressure, leaving me paralyzed, not knowing what to do as the creature, or whatever it was, approached. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The hours seemed to drag on, and the darkness that surrounded us was laden with something we couldn't name. But we knew it was deadly. Fear, which was already consuming us, now became a palpable force, forcing us to question every movement and every sound. What was outside was not just a physical threat. It was a predator that knew us better than we knew ourselves, capable of mimicking and manipulating our perceptions. Harley, Andrew and I were in the cabin, fixing our eyes on the cameras. Each of us tried, in some way, to understand what was happening, but as time passed, the explanations began to unravel. The radio was muted, and the communication between us seemed more like a distant memory. We no longer had confidence in anything, not even in ourselves. Reality was distorting before our eyes, and whatever was out there was getting closer and closer. It was then that Andrew's voice cut through the silence. Her voice was strange, muffled, as if something was distorting her. "Alex, Harley, don't leave me here. He's imitating my voice. It's not me anymore. It's here, near. I can't." The radio sizzled, and the transmission was cut off. Panic took hold of me. Andrew was somewhere outside, but we could no longer trust either his voice or the camera. Footage. The creature, which had previously moved only in the shadows, now seemed to have taken on a new strategy. He was using our fears, our expectations, against us. I glanced quickly at Harley, who was nearby, but she looked as lost as I was. Her eyes fixed on the screen, where the figure that appeared to be Andrew moved among the trees. Each step was more erratic, more distorted. His movements were unnatural. Something was very wrong. But most terrifying of all was the proximity with which that figure approached our station. "It can't be him," Harley said, his voice trembling. "It can't be, Alex." I didn't know what else to say. Reality was breaking into pieces, and the doubt that was growing inside us seemed to be consuming us. We needed to act. We needed to get out of there. That's when we heard the sound, a heavy bang, as if something very large was hitting the walls of the cabin. There was no longer any doubt. Whatever it was now much closer. The monster, no longer hid in the shadows. He was at our door. I quickly grabbed the gun, breathing quickening, trying to stay calm, but there was no more time. The door was opened with such a strong impact that it almost fell from its supports. At the entrance, the creature appeared, no longer as a shadow, but in its grotesque and distorted form. His legs were long and crooked, his arms extended unnaturally, and his eyes, those damned golden eyes, shone brightly in the darkness, reflecting all that we feared. Harley and I were paralyzed. Andrew was no longer there. There was no more room for doubt. The creature had imitated our every move, every strategy, and now stood before us like a twisted version of everything we knew. But the most disturbing thing was realizing that it wasn't just a hunt. It wasn't just a physical being trying to devour us. The creature was playing with us, manipulating us in a way we never imagined. She knew we could no longer trust our own eyes. I knew that our perception of reality had been broken, and now all that was left was to fight or succumb to the terror that had settled in our minds. I looked at Harley, and for a moment we both knew what had to be done. There was no more choice. The only thing left was to resist. I never thought the environment could be a weapon, but that night, the Silver Pines forest seemed to become an extension of the nightmare. With each step we took, the trees around us transformed. The space seemed to be distorted, as if nature itself was manipulated, as if the park was being shaped by the will of the creature. I knew we could no longer trust what we saw. The forest, which had once seemed so imposing and tranquil, now became a living prison, an impenetrable labyrinth where the exit always seemed out of reach. Harley, Andrew, and I ran aimlessly, trying to get away from the cabin that had become the epicenter of our terror. But at every turn, at every step, the scenery around us disintegrated. The forest, which should have been familiar, now seemed to transform, as if the trees were moving around, the mist creeping erratically between the trees. The feeling of being lost came not only from our orientation, but from the environment itself, which seemed to be an extension of the creature that hunted us. "We can't trust anything anymore," Harley said, her voice breaking. She was exhausted, but her mind was alerted. The confusion was visible on his face. "These trees, these trails, nothing is as it was before. I swear that path wasn't there." She was right. What had once been clear, open trails now seemed to merge into a mixture of shadows and twisted logs. Each time we looked back, we could no longer distinguish the path we had traveled. The terrain was becoming a jumble of shapes, as if space itself was being manipulated, distorted by the presence of the creature. We no longer knew where we were, nor where to go. It was as if the forest was closing in on us, distorting the world around us. The idea that the creature was influencing the environment seemed more real than ever. The feeling of being watched kept growing. I looked up at the sky, trying to find a point of reference, but what I saw made me stop. The stars were there, but the sky looked different, as if it had been erased and redrawn. There was no longer that familiarity that I had always felt when looking into space. It was as if the cosmos around us had changed, as if the universe itself was distorting in response to our presence. Something wasn't right. The feeling of confusion and disorientation increased even more when we started to hear the sound of the wind, but it did not come from where it should. It was as if the sound was coming from all directions at once, the rustle of leaves and branches mingling with other sounds, almost impossible to identify. I felt as if the forest was alive, reacting to us, trying to confuse us even more. Andrew was panting, trying to keep up the pace, but the pressure was too much. "I don't know what's real anymore, Alex," he said, his voice sounding distant. "I see shadows moving in the corner of my eyes, and when I look directly, I don't see anything. What are we actually seeing? What is that?" I tried to control the panic that was beginning to spread through me as well. With each step, we felt as if the forest was swallowing us, absorbing us in the darkness. The fear that the creature might be manipulating reality itself began to consume me. Every noise, every movement in the shadows seemed designed to disorient us, to make us question even our own sanity. The worst of all was when, looking to the side, I saw a figure. It was a silhouette, but not just any silhouette. It was a version of me, or at least it seemed like it. She was a few meters away, walking towards us, but her steps were irregular, distorted. I stopped, frozen, as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. It was a copy of me, but somehow it wasn't. The eyes, the golden eyes shone, and the next moment the figure disappeared, leaving only darkness behind. I looked at Harley and Andrew, hoping they had seen the same. Their faces were pale, but nothing I saw seemed to be real. The perception of reality was beginning to fail completely. I felt completely disoriented, trapped in a psychological game where the boundaries between what was true and what was manipulation disappeared. "We need to get out of here," Harley said, her voice now firm but full of fear. She looked at the trees in front of us and, with a gesture, indicated a path between them. "Here, now." But as soon as we started running, the feeling of being watched grew even more, and the forest seemed to change once more, as if the trees were closing in around us, creating a prison of wood and leaves. I knew we couldn't trust anything anymore, not the forest, not our minds. The only way now was to move on and hope that our perception of reality would be enough to keep us alive. But as we progressed, one thing became clear. The creature knew us better than we knew ourselves, and that was what scared us the most. What happened in the following hours was a whirlwind of sensations and hastily made decisions. We were exhausted, our perception of reality already compromised, but something inside me still didn't want to accept that all was lost. No matter how many times the forest closed in, or how the scenery around us changed, there was a part of me that still believed we could escape. Hope, as fragile as it was still there. But at the same time, terror was taking over, and the choices we made now were no longer logical. They were desperate. Harley, Andrew, and I moved without clear direction, just moving forward. Each move seemed more difficult than the last. Fear was ingrained in every fiber of our bodies. I would look at the trees, looking for some sign, some familiar landmark that would tell us that we were still in control, but the truth was that we were completely at the mercy of that place. The forest stretched endlessly, and the more we ran, the more it seemed to lengthen, making it impossible to see the end. It was as if the space around us was distorted, an invisible trap where the paths led nowhere. The pace has not only slowed down physically, but also emotionally. We were beginning to understand that the struggle for survival was no longer a matter of strength or speed, but of mental toughness. What once seemed like a simple attempt to escape turned into a race against fear itself. The feeling of being persecuted, of being constantly watched, became even more oppressive. It was as if we were being tested, not by the creature itself, but by the very distorted nature of the environment that surrounded us. At a certain point, we stopped. Not because we wanted to, but because our bodies could no longer move forward. Fatigue had taken hold of us, and the lack of clarity about what was happening around us made us hesitate. I looked at Andrew, who looked as lost as I was, his clothes dirty and sweaty, his eyes shining with fear and fatigue. Harley stood beside him, breathing heavily, his shoulders slumped, as if hope had left his body with each step. Our faces were dirty and pale, but the scariest thing was that even though we were together, we felt more distant than ever. "We can't go on like this anymore," Harley said, breaking the silence. "We don't know where we are anymore, and it seems like everything we've tried is taking us back to the same place." She was right. With every step we took, we felt like we were moving away from reality, and everything the creature had manipulated was slowly crushing us. Our senses were failing. I didn't know who to trust anymore, or even if what was happening was really real. The forest seemed to have swallowed our fears, transforming them into something tangible, something impossible to combat. As we recovered, a strange feeling came over me. The silence around us was muffled, But somewhere, far enough away that we couldn't see, something moved. It was a low sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to make us look in all directions. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, but I knew it wasn't. There was something lurking, something waiting for us to get completely tired. I knew that before we made any decision, the creature was watching us, studying us. What bothered me most was the feeling that we were being led by something bigger than ourselves, like puppets being pulled by invisible wires. The forest, which now seemed to be alive, was forcing us to play its game. There was no more control, no more choices, just a growing pressure, a weight on our minds, which left us almost without the strength to react. And then the sound became clearer. It was not a distant noise, it was closer, more direct. The steps were getting louder, firmer. Something was approaching. It was inevitable. We could no longer escape. The fall of the stock did not mean rest. It meant that the real battle was about to begin, and it would be fought not only against the creature, but against our own mind, our sanity. The game was about to become deadlier than we ever imagined. "It's coming here," said Andrew, his voice full of dread. "There is no more time." I looked at Harley, and she, speechless, began to move slowly forward, as if she had already accepted that there was no turning back. Whatever it was, we were ready to face it. Or at least, try. The air around us was heavier, as if the forest had absorbed our fears and was giving them back in a tangible way. The sound of approaching footsteps was now perfectly synchronized with the racing beats of my heart. Something was about to happen, and we could all feel it. But as the terror spread through each of us, something else began to emerge, a feeling that I couldn't identify, but that was deeply connected to what was happening there. The forest wasn't just physically imprisoning us, it was connecting us, in some way, to what had happened before, to a distant past that seemed to have been forgotten, but which now became impossible to ignore. I looked at Harley and Andrew, who seemed to feel the same as I did, as if something from another era was trying to infiltrate our perception. The trees, the shadows, everything there seemed to have a story of its own, a history that we did not know, but that somehow was intertwined with our own destiny. "Have you ever felt that?" I asked, my voice low. He didn't want to believe what he was beginning to realize, but even so, the words escaped. Harley looked at me with a look of concern, but also with a hint of suspicion. "Feel what, Alex?" She didn't seem to understand, but the tension on her face suggested that she was already starting to feel the weight of what was approaching. I hesitated for a moment, trying to get the right words in. It's as if what is happening here had already happened before, as if the forest had been shaped by something old, something that we can't see but it's still here, something that knows what we're thinking. Andrew looked at me, and his eyes shone with an understanding that startled me. "You're talking about the stories, those stories we never wanted to believe, but now we are seeing what happened to the others. We are in the same place." I knew he was talking about the old. Reports of disappearances in the region, the legends that we were never able to fully demystify. Those who disappeared into the depths of silver pines, whose bodies were never found, and whose names were slowly erased by history, as if the forest was trying to keep its secrets buried. But now, with the weight of the supernatural pressing down on our minds, the line between what we knew and what we were experiencing became increasingly blurred. Whatever was hunting us, it wasn't just a creature, a beast without form or reason. It was something much older, something that had deep roots in silver pines, something that knew how to manipulate space, time, perception, a presence that fed, not only on our bodies, but on our connection to the past. "Alex, what do you mean by that?" asked Harley, her voice more tense than ever. "What is happening here does not make sense. The forest, the shadows, everything. It's like it's molding itself around us." I didn't have an explanation, but I knew that what we were facing now was not a simple physical threat. It wasn't just a creature trying to hunt us. It was an ancient power, rooted in something that the former rangers had tried to understand and control, but couldn't. And now we were part of it, like lost pieces thrown into a game of something that was beyond our comprehension. I don't know what it is, but something is manipulating time. Or perhaps space, Andrew said, his voice strange. Everything here is distorted. Look at the trees, look at the sky. What we're seeing, it's not real. I looked up at the sky again, and something that had once seemed familiar, the vastness of space, the stars, was now constantly changing. What had been a tranquil sky now seemed to move, as if the constellations were rearranging themselves before our eyes, as if reality itself was being rearranged by something or someone, and the feeling that the place was holding us, as if it was absorbing us in its own cycle, grew even more. I knew something was about to happen, something that could destroy us or trap us in an eternal cycle. The stories of the past began to materialize before us, and we could no longer ignore what was coming. I took a deep breath, trying to concentrate. The creature, the enemy, was approaching, but it was no longer just her. Whatever was watching, us manipulating us, was now about to confront us in a way we never imagined. "Get ready," I said, my voice firmer. "What is coming is not just the creature. It's not just what we see. It is in something deeper, and we need to figure out how to break that before it's too late." What we were facing wasn't just a blood-hungry creature. Something inside me was beginning to realize that there was a deeper, more macabre purpose behind all this. The Skinwalker didn't seem to be content with just hunting us. He was manipulating our minds, pushing us to a point where the lines between reality and illusion were already blurred. That being didn't just want revenge, he wanted something we couldn't understand. "It's not just about us," Andrew said, his voice hesitating. It does not see us as prey. This is something bigger, something that feeds on more than our flesh." He was right. It wasn't just a matter of physical destruction. It was something deeper, more cruel. The Skinwalker was feeding on our doubt, on our ability to question everything we were experiencing. Each of us was being tested, not only in our survival, but in our perception of who we were and what we stood for there. What he wanted was not simply to kill us. He wanted to break us from the inside out, to make us lose track of what was real. Harley, her expression still scarred by fear, looked at Andrew and me as if, for the first time, she was beginning to understand what was really at stake. "It is feeding on our doubt, our confusion. Whatever, it's not just hunting us, it's trying to break us." I knew she was right. The creature manipulates us in a way that we can't even express. It's not just a matter of physically attacking them, but of destroying what we are in essence, of forcing us to question our own identity and the meaning of our struggle. "What is he looking for then?" I asked, not expecting an immediate answer. What Skinwalker wanted was not something tangible. He didn't just want to kill or destroy. He wanted to consume something more fundamental. Harley shook his head, as if words failed him, but fear was clear in his eyes. "He wants to replace us. He is doing everything to make us what he is." I had no more doubts. The creature wasn't just behind us physically. She wanted to take hold of our humanity, our memories, everything that made us who we were. The Skinwalker somehow didn't just want to get revenge. He wanted to become a part of us. And as we tried to escape, he forced us to confront our own essence, to question who we were becoming. What are we left with when we are cornered, with no way out, and reality begins to disintegrate before our eyes? How can we fight against something that not only threatens our lives, but everything we are? The Skinwalker, this entity that seeks more than simple destruction, is no ordinary creature. It is the reflection of our own fears and insecurities, A force that feeds not only on the body, but on the soul, on the human spirit. He does not hunt us by instinct, but by intention. And it is exactly this detail that makes us question, to what extent are we willing to resist when the struggle is not only physical, but mental and spiritual? Everything we have experienced so far has been proof that the greatest enemy does not come from the shadows or the creatures of the night, but from within ourselves. The Skinwalker feeds on doubts, confusion, lack of clarity. He wants to see us lose the ability to distinguish between the real and the imagined, between what we are and what we can become. He doesn't just seek revenge, he seeks to destroy our essence, dilute our identity until nothing remains, turning us into a copy, an imitation of what we once were. Every moment we give in to fear, every second we spend doubting our own sanity, is one step closer to becoming what it desires, a vague shadow of what we were. As we watched the shadows of the forest, we knew we were at the center of a game we didn't choose to play. The creature, with its supernatural power, fed on our despair, forcing us to face not only physical danger, but a much deeper internal battle. We were in a confrontation with something we didn't understand, something that couldn't be explained by any logic or reason. The Skinwalker, however, wasn't just a monster. He was the manifestation of all that we fear to lose. He didn't want to destroy us for simple pleasure. He wanted to absorb our essence, take us out of ourselves, and take on our forms, our memories, our lives. But while all this was happening, a question lingered in my mind. How far are we willing to go to maintain who we are? How far can our humanity take us when we are forced to fight an enemy who knows our innermost fears and our deepest weaknesses? The struggle was not just a race to survive, it was a journey to preserve our identity, our soul. With each attempt to flee, to resist, the Skinwalker came closer, not only physically but psychologically. He wasn't just hunting us, he was molding us, trying to make us part of him, a copy of what he wanted us to be. And as he approached, I realized something crucial. It wasn't just our lives that were at risk. Our perception of who we were, our understanding of reality, was about to be erased forever. The greatest danger was not to be physically destroyed, but to be consumed, transformed into something we did not recognize. We, as human beings, have always prided ourselves on our ability to reason, to understand the world around us, and to fight against the enemies that threaten us. But the Skinwalker was no ordinary enemy. He was the ultimate test for our psyche, a brutal reminder that not everything can be explained or controlled. As we advanced, the line between the real and the unreal became more and more blurred. What we were facing was not a struggle to survive physically, but a battle for our own sanity, for the preservation of our humanity. I looked at the others, saw the same struggle reflected in their eyes. The fear, the weariness, the mistrust, all of these were shaping us. But deep down, we knew that true victory would not just be to make it out alive, it would be resisting what we wanted to leave behind, what Skinwalker wanted us to become. The real battle was not to fight him physically, but to not allow him to win our identity, our essence. The Skinwalker didn't just want to kill us. He wanted to erase us, to turn us into a distorted copy of everything we once were. But through it all, there was something in us, something profoundly human that still endured. We could not allow him to take us completely. We couldn't let him turn us into empty shadows of who we were. Every second, every breath was a choice between giving in to fear or fighting for our true identity. And in the end, it is this struggle that defines who we are. Not the creatures that hunt us, nor the challenges we face, but our ability to resist what tries to erase us. True strength is not in fighting against what we see, but in resisting what is hidden inside us, what makes us doubt, what tries to transform us. Whatever the Skinwalker was, his true nature would never be fully known. But one thing was certain: we were more than his copies, and that in itself was our greatest victory.